Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second professional development webinar. This is featuring another one of our great JAC journal articles. Katie Sanders is going to be leading this presentation about the systematic literature review of the intersection between social media and cultural identity, implications for agricultural and environmental communication. So I'm just going to do a brief overview. Social media has radically changed human communication patterns, impacting how people perceive scientific information. Understanding these communication patterns is critical for work in the agricultural and environmental sciences. Sanders and her colleagues explored how cultural identity impacts the use of and engagement with social media content related to agriculture and the environment through a qualitative literature review. Despite the availability of several studies integrating cultural identity, environment, and social media, a gap was observed within the research directly examining the intersection of science communication, cultural identity, and social media. Due to the changing dynamics in agricultural and environmental communication proliferated through social media channels, scholars consider the connections between identity, scientific information, and social media messaging for effective communication strategies. So I am going to now turn this over to Dr. Alexa Lamb, who is going to introduce the researchers, and then Katie will begin her presentation.
Thank you so much, Lori. Hi, everyone. I am Alexa Lamb from the University of Georgia, an associate professor of science communication, and we're thrilled to be here to talk with you all about identity and its role on social media. This is a core area of interest for Katie Sanders, who's a doctoral student here at the University of Georgia, and the foundation for her dissertation research. So I know she's excited to share with you what she found as she worked with Dr. Fali Massambuka-Kenchewa and I. Dr. Massambuka-Kenchewa is now at Iowa State University, an assistant professor of ag communications. But the three of us worked together when she was here to do this important analysis in the literature around identity, who we see ourselves as, who we portray ourselves as, and I hope you find it as intriguing as we did. So with that, Katie, I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lamb. So today we're going to start with a quick overview just of the research itself to provide some context, and then we're really going to spend some time with some key takeaways and implications for communication. So I'm Katie Sanders. I published this research under Katie Dobbins. So I also want to thank my co-authors, Dr. Massambuka-Kenchewa and Dr. Lamb, for helping me move this research process along. So today, I really hope that everyone takes away some key learning objectives, which includes the role of identity within science communication, how social media users construct online identities, differences between agricultural and environmental communication on social media, and the importance of considering identity when crafting messages. But before we dive in, I want us all to do a little activity to kind of start thinking about ourselves and explore our own relationship with social media, kind of as a jumping off point for today's presentation. So there is a link in the chat to a Jamboard, which I will share with everyone, and I would love for you all to follow the prompts on that Jamboard. I can share the board here as well. So the first two slides are a little bit of reflection that we're going to do today. So I want you all to think about, for what purposes do you use the following platforms? I know there's a lot more social media platforms out there than these four, but I just used these four because I know they're predominantly used within the United States. So if you just want to take a sticky note, you can type your answer, you can choose your color, you can save it, and then place it next to the social media channel of your choice. We've got connecting with friends, sharing pictures of my kids, with family and friends. With Facebook, following friends from far away, sharing stories about students, faculty, and alumni. These are all on Facebook, okay. Sharing scientific research on Twitter, home and to work accounts, reaching farmers, staying in contact with friends and family. Yeah, and sometimes the sticky notes stack on each other, so if you need to move them around. Being inspired by beautiful places and things. Personal only. So we kind of see already a distinction coming between this personal and professional use of social media channels. Different content being shared, different groups you're connecting with, family, friends, colleagues. So this little distinguishment between professional and personal. Okay, so these are a lot of great ideas. I see sharing news, professional networking, reaching industry. Wow, we're doing a lot of good work on social media. Okay, so we see all the opportunities for using social media. So now I want to turn us to slide 2. Ooh, we got those influencers on Instagram too. All right. So now I want us all to think about who we interact with on these platforms. Some of that came through in the previous slide. But I really want you to think about what groups of people you specifically interact with on each. I know we saw family and friends with Facebook, friends and family on Instagram, along with influencers. So yeah, who are we connecting with? Got colleagues on LinkedIn. Friends and colleagues on Facebook. Friends and alumni, friends and colleagues. Alumni of the college on Twitter. Potential students on Facebook, family and friends. Friends or acquaintances. All right, so again, a lot of different people we're connecting with, but interestingly, while we see some distinctions between LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, generally we're using one channel to communicate with several different audiences. Those might be people that we know, people that we would like to recruit to the college, other colleagues that we have met either face-to-face or just online, different members of the industry. So that has some really interesting implications for how we communicate online, because we're using a personal communication channel that both our friends, our family, our colleagues, and strangers see. So thank you all for participating in that. That sets us up really nicely for our discussion today. And I hope you all did some good reflecting on your use of social media. So I will return to my presentation now. So essentially, I wanted you all to start thinking about the social media platforms you're using and the different people you connect with on each. For just about 2 minutes here, I'd love for you all to just either think and reflect or jot down some ideas about how you might describe those with whom you interact, which a lot of you did, categorizing them and your relationships with them. And then also think about what types of messages do they engage with on social media? The people that you see on social media, what information do you see them connecting with? And then finally, I want you to think about how might the people that you engage with on social media describe you? So think on that for a little bit and keep those thoughts rolling as we continue our discussion today. Essentially, I want us to start thinking about how people perceive you on social media as a communicator. As communicators, we're used to thinking about how others present themselves online, but we're increasingly using social media to communicate about ag and natural resources and other scientific information online. We saw that in the Jamboard. We're connecting with members of industry, we're connecting with potential students. But because communicators themselves also have an identity, whether or not we consciously engage it or recognize it, we represent that on social media through the messages that we use. These perceived identities, whether accurate or not, are taken up with our messages and within the groups that we engage with on social media. We know that social media is becoming a primary news and information source, and that it has also changed the ways that humans communicate and interact. So people generally use social media to create platforms where members identify with and embrace others to feel valued and accepted. Through social media, they feel heard and respected for their thoughts and feelings. So what's interesting about social media is not only are people going there to get news, but there's also a lot of emotions and affective qualities to social media. So there's this entanglement between news and feeling that really merits a look at identity in the online environment. Looking at social media, culture, and agriculture, there are a couple of key points for us to think about. Due to changing demographics and changing communication technologies, this affects the way that the public perceives agricultural and natural resource information. Agricultural and natural resource science communicators need to know that messages are dependent on both the cultural characteristics of the sender and the receiver of the message. But there's limited research that exists examining this intersection between culture, ag-comm, and social media. In order to create effective communication strategies, we need to know the audience's cultural orientation. So I've thrown this word around a little bit, but I want to take a second to really define it. So what is identity? Something we hear a lot in the cultural discourse now. It's becoming a buzzword, but specifically since the question our research wanted to answer is how is identity constructed and reproduced in the online environment, it merits a working definition. So we classified identity in our research as how individuals classify or categorize themselves through a process of perception and differentiation with others. People classify themselves and others into social categories, and this impacts group behavior and decision-making. Identity, though, is fluid. It's not really a static construct. It may be stable over periods of time, but we grow and evolve our identities based on our experiences, our age, and all types of things. Social identity and culture affects social cognition and the decision-making processes related. Culture specifically looks at the diverse repertoires of practices, values, and beliefs that individuals use to engage and make sense of the world to accomplish purposes valued by them and the communities in which they participate. So we know that both cultural and identity characteristics are affecting consumer groups, industry groups, and others that we're communicating with online. Briefly looking at our research, I wanted to define the theoretical framework we used. So we use social representations theory, which is defined as a system of opinions, knowledge, and beliefs particular to a culture, a social category, or a group with regard to objects in the social environment. Social representations facilitate communication processes within social groups and provides the potential for identity formation and social norm projection for understanding and interpreting social reality. Social representations theory is key for science communication efforts because it helps us understand how an issue is represented in society and how people perceive that issue. So the purpose of our research was to explore how cultural identity impacts the use, engagement, and trust in social media messages. Our first research question looked at how people identify themselves culturally while engaging on social media. We also looked at how people's cultural identities affect their choice of individuals to follow or interact with on social media. as well as how social media users' cultural identities impact their engagement with social media platforms when seeking agricultural and environmental information. Briefly looking at our methods, we conducted a systematic literature review to see how previous researchers had dealt with these three topics. We looked at 71 articles across the Journal of Applied Communications, the Journal of Agricultural and Human Values, and through two databases, Google Scholar and the Web of Science. We conducted a qualitative content analysis using an inductive coding technique to look at what themes were identified in the articles. But expanded methods can be found in our article, Dobbins et al. 2021. So I want to twist our research questions around a little bit and ask you all, how do you think people might identify themselves culturally while engaging on social media? I'll stop the share for a second. How might people identify themselves culturally while engaging on social media? It's a bit of a tricky question.
Comment in the chat box says political identity.
Political identity, definitely. Keep thinking about how that might happen while I share what we found in the literature. Oh, we have parent and non-parent as well. That's especially pertinent to Facebook and Instagram. Profile description and words and photos used. Gender, college graduate. Yes, so a lot of people have intersecting identities that they represent across social media. Other accounts followed impact that, their geographic region. Yes, these are all really great conceptions of identity online. So we've come up with some great brainstorming ideas for future research, but here's what the literature showed us. We identified what we called an identity cycle. So this is a process of identity formation, reinforcement, and performance of identity in the online environment. This is particularly coming from research about millennials and Gen Z using social media during their college experience. Individuals form a new identity online within social media networks. Then they either change or continue that identity based on reactions they receive from members of their social media community. Then they continue to perform that identity after formation and reinforcement. But that is subject to change if other reactions are experienced in the social media space and the cycle repeats itself. So in this way, we can see how identity can be stable over short periods of time, but is ultimately fluid and reactionary to our different lived experiences. One thing I want to say is we also think primarily about Gen Z and millennials as digital natives and primarily identifying their identity online. But emerging research is showing that this is true across generational groups. So it's no longer just a digital native concept, that all people interacting online engage in some type of identity formation and identity cycle. That's where we start seeing this change from traditional conceptions of social identity to a new social media identity. This social media identity is a process of an individual's history, their offline and online community, their online engagement, and new identity formation. And this is acquired through the identity cycle. And key here is this vacillation between community groups that they have offline, which could be family, friends, and these people that they're creating community memberships with online. And again, we saw this in the chat. Political ideology played a large role in the development and maintenance of online networked communities. And in fact, within environmental communication was the largest and most widely used predictor variable for belief in specific environmental issues. So I want us to brainstorm again. After reviewing the results for research question 1, how do people's cultural identities affect their choice of individuals to follow or interact with on social media? So we have religious affiliation, region where they live. How might this cultural identity impact who people choose to follow or interact with on social media? Political party, yes, again, playing a large role, especially in US and Western-based social media systems. Friends in real life. Yeah, again, that vacillation between online and offline community. Views becoming more narrow, so maybe referring to echo chambers created on social media. These are really good responses. So I'll turn now to what the results showed us. And then maybe we can brainstorm further. So primarily the way that people interacted with others online was through a community and specific interpersonal motivations for use. We saw how these communities were built through the identity cycle and constructed between these online and offline identities. Primary to identity or community development within the online environment is this sense of belongingness, kinship, and like-mindedness. We see this move toward a self-identification through online communities. And like I hinted at earlier, this is becoming a transgenerational characteristic, not just one for digital natives. These communities are primarily built around similar interests. Again, that echo chamber we kind of talked about in the comment or the chat box. And people had various motivations for use. Specifically, they wanted to engage in interpersonal interaction. They wanted to maintain and form online relationships. They were looking for social support, but also they were seeking information. And that's where this tricky, complex environment of social support, friendliness, and information seeking kind of complexifies the online environment. They're building a sense of collective self-esteem and group identity through the communities formed on social media. And then looking from an agricultural perspective, several studies showed that members joined social media to specifically promote the agricultural industry, or for both agriculturalists and environmentalists to advocate for a specific cause. And then finally, our third research question, keeping in mind results from research question 1 and 2, how do social media users' cultural identities impact their engagement with social media platforms when seeking agricultural and environmental information? So I know Dr. MK wants to add a comment before we dive into research question 3.
Thank you. I just also wanted to emphasize that as Katie already discussed, that the identity changes. So the other thing that we also observed was that the same person may have different identities based on the social media that they're using. So that's another important thing that you have to note, to take note of, to say these identities, like she said, they're fluid, but they also depend on the social media that they're using. So for example, Facebook groups, like you already said, people join because of their political ideology. So when they're on that group where they're talking about political ideologies, they'll talk about, they'll identify themselves as belonging to this specific political party or whatever it is. But then when they also find themselves in a different group, they'll also identify themselves differently. So that's another important point to note, that this identity changes based on the social media platform that the person is using.
Yes, great point. Looking back to that identity cycle, it kind of happens within each social media platform. So while one identity cycle is happening on Facebook, a different one can be happening on Twitter. And we saw that in our own experiment with Jamboard. Like, we ourselves are presenting different identities and engaging with different community groups and group memberships online. And so that means that the identities we present might look different across platforms. So thanks for adding that in, Dr. MK. Dr. Gula says her identity is much different on LinkedIn than Facebook. I think that's fairly true across the board for many people. So thinking about this concept of identity on social media, how do we think that impacts people's engagement with agricultural and environmental information? I know one thing we talked about was political ideology that might impact the type of information received. I'll go ahead and share our results, and if it jogs any ideas, feel free to add it in the chat. If people who believe in science are more likely to believe agricultural and environmental information, that's a great addition. So when we're looking at engagement with agricultural and environmental information, we see two key components: the impact of message acceptance and interactions with diverse viewpoints. So message acceptance is really key to us communicators because cultural identification impacted both the type of agricultural information shared and received. Demographic variables impacted the acceptance of science messages for both agricultural information, climate change, and other environmental issues. And we know that cultural identification impacts the perceived trustworthiness of messages. This relates to what Mersdorf et al. Talked about with identity protective cognition. So in identity protective cognition, when individuals are presented with information such as climate change that may counter their group membership's belief, if they're within groups that deny the impacts of climate change, group members will actually reject the scientific message and conform to group belief rather than accepting your message. So this is even more complex in the social media environment where echo chambers are limiting the types of information impacted or disseminated and really bolstering this identity protective cognition within groups. So these online communities impact acceptance, and we're starting to see a growing antagonism between farmers and consumers online, as Rott's 2018 discussed. We also see how agriculturalists are critical about negative messaging about the industry online, which nobody likes seeing bad things about themselves online. But we have to learn how to be nimble and engage with these negative messaging strategies in a way that kind of allows us to share our narratives to a broader audience. Surprisingly, people encounter diverse viewpoints negatively online. I know, not a big surprise there due to this identity protective cognition. People don't really like hearing things that counteract their beliefs. We also see from an agricultural communication standpoint and agriculturalist standpoint, a growing frustration for people without agricultural backgrounds. And this means that agriculturalists face challenges navigating online conversations and end up actually just being mostly absent. They don't want to deal with the contentious issues online, and so they just stay out. Though there is potential for social media to expose people to other cultural viewpoints, this is really difficult due to the predispositions that we have in the growing echo chambers online. So as communicators within agricultural and the environmental sciences, we have to know that people don't really want to encounter viewpoints that directly contradict their belief systems. So how do we craft messages that engender trust with the audience while not negating their closely held values and beliefs? We did see some key differences emerge between agricultural and environmental communication research. So within ag communication research specifically, we saw literature primarily focused on content creators rather than content users. We saw investigations of creators using social media to share stories about production agriculture to enhance trustworthiness of the industry by consumers. Culture was dealt with specifically related to the content creator's belief about the impact of social media, but there wasn't a holistic understanding or use of identity or cultural orientation for messaging. They would generally describe participants based on their connection to agriculture for the purposes of marketing or reputation preservation for the industry. And there was no research looking specifically at identity in social media specifically. Since the publication of our article, King and Settle did publish in the same issue, an article looking at producers' use of social media and their community building around that, but it's still an area ripe for future research. Looking to the environmental and natural resource communication research, they more consistently used identity concepts and research about environmental issues, but they primarily just use segmented demographics, not a holistic conceptualization of identity. Again, we see this political belief coming up again, and it was the most used demographic for predicting a belief in environmental and science communication messages. But there's this limited use of identity based on geographical locations, cultural worldviews, individualist, collectivist, or any wide array of identity beyond a demographic section on a survey. So a key takeaway from this is that agricultural communications and environmental communications research differ in their use of identity and people's perception of scientific information. So essentially, our literature review revealed a large gap in the nexus of science communication, cultural identity, and social media. Essentially, identity mediates how we use technology. Some key considerations for science communicators include gaining a perspective of a group's identity formation may help communicate about polarizing topics. So this isn't just looking at what these groups believe, but how they came to that belief. Because if we understand how they came to that belief, we can better orient our messaging around ways that don't contradict belief systems and immediately usher in that identity protective cognition. At this point in social media, specifically in Western countries, it's difficult to detach culture and political ideology in current social media contexts. The literature revealed that political ideology plays a large role in creating these networked communities online. So it's something that we as science communicators will have to integrate into our messaging. We know that traditional deficit models of science communication are not as effective. We can't just produce information and put it out there and people will take it up and that will solve science issues because there's a vast array of misinformation being perpetuated online daily. We can use the role of identity in message acceptance or rejection along the social representations theory to help craft messages. But we also need to be attuned to how messages are distributed and distorted within social media. So again, it's not just a knowledge deficit, but a dissemination issue as well. We can look at audience segmentation strategies in different ways by incorporating complex, holistic views of culture and identity beyond demographic segmentation. But there's further research needed in how to identify cultural identity segments within social media. We also need to recognize ourselves, agricultural and science communicators, as an identity group. We are all oriented around agriculture in some way, and often we're directly connected to it through our families and own personal histories. That puts us in a bind sometimes when we're communicating with consumers who are not oriented around agriculture. But because we have these close valuations of agriculture with our own personal histories, this may lead to this tension we saw between farmers, consumers, agriculturalists, and consumers. And when that tension happens, it can limit our communication efficacy. So essentially, it's not just about understanding others' identities, but also our own, and remaining cognizant of that in the ways that we communicate. So let's return to the Jamboard. So the link should be in there. I can copy it for anyone who joined. All right, so if we go to slide 4, I would love for you all to just put on a sticky one of your key takeaways from the presentation to this point to share with the group. If anyone needs a reminder, you can just hit the little sticky, change your color, and type your answer and it'll post. So I see social representations theory. Language used should resonate with our intended audiences in a positive way. How I present myself on social media as a communicator influences the success of my scientific messaging. People have different identities and they may not necessarily reflect their true identities on social media. That is interesting because we saw how people can present different identities online, but adding to the complexity of identity is how well do our perceptions of someone's identity align with their own perceived identity? And that's something else that we have to account for when messaging. And how well our own identity is being correctly perceived by the consumers and receivers of our messages. So just ever-growing complexities related to identity and social media. We have the social identity portrayed varies across platforms, and we have to be careful about the language we use to ensure all audiences feel connected to our messages. I like that phrase, feeling connected to our messages. That's a really affective quality that identity is trying to conceptualize within communication. People follow folks to support their own views. Yes, definitely. How our own identity can affect the messages that others absorb. There's an imbalance of information since people don't necessarily want to engage in potentially combative situations. Yes, we saw that agriculturalists tend to shy away from some of those contentious topics. So how can we train future communicators through this identity lens to better navigate these hot topics on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram? Great takeaways. Thank you all for sharing. So if you move to slide 5, and if you don't want to post on the sticky, you can post in the chat or you could just unmute yourself. But I'd love to hear a little bit about, based either on your work or work that you've encountered, what polarizing scientific topics might benefit from a comprehensive conceptualization of identity. GMOs, yes. Climate change. Dr. Lamb, if you would like to read anything that happens in the chat, that would be great. COVID. Interestingly, all of our research collected was pre-March of 2020. So I'm sure doing this literature review now would reveal some vastly different insights and takeaways due to the COVID-19 era. Livestock production, water use, wolves, organic. So would anybody like to share why they posted their topic? And maybe how identity can help us navigate those communications online? I can start with one that I'm interested in related to GMOs, and then feel free to jump in if you'd like to share. What's interesting about GMOs is it's really this embodied thing. We're eating this food, and food has a long history of cultural heritage and cultural representation. So when scientists were developing the innovation for GMOs, and we thought, well, it's such a great thing, it's going to help reduce food security, everyone's going to love it. A lot of us failed to consider those cultural implications, those embodied implications that stem from our values and belief systems that make us accept or reject a message. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm asking you to think how people come to have these identities rather than what those identities are, because often they're built on layers of cultural worldviews and traditions. We're really used to seeing these polarized topics based on political ideology, but there are lots of cultural implications in there as well.
Katie, I'll jump in with another example, especially because there's some conversation in the chat box. Sherry Hoyer shared another article that's focused on climate change. And it sounds like they might do an ACE webinar even on that manuscript, but climate change is the sticky note that resonated with me up here, especially in the political climate this past year, as we saw our change in administration from one that was very, that didn't like to use the term climate change with regularity, and we did not see a lot of financial support coming from the federal government for climate change research and science, to one now that is very proactive about climate change. And so I personally, as a researcher that examines conversations around climate change, feel much freer in my identity on social media to speak about climate change in the current climate, administrative climate, than I did prior to the change in administration. So I think that political views that was brought up very early on definitely plays a role in how I put my identity out there when it comes to climate change conversations.
Alex, I'll just add that we actually started using climate variability because that's what we were told to use during the previous administration, and that's completely changed. Now we're very forward with our communications from the experimentation when it comes to climate change.
Yes, and I did the same exact thing. So it is interesting. It changed our language, right? Just the political climate changed our language.
And so that's also interesting because sometimes, no matter what our identity says, there are policy things imposed on us that limit our own identity expression. So just layers and layers of complexity within identity and social media research. But these are really great topics.
And also to add on that, I think another element that comes in is also a theme that came up that we didn't dive much during the research. It was like, how attached is the person towards that identity? So we discovered that if you look at people coming from individualistic societies versus those who are coming from collective societies, their ability to express themselves on these social media platforms is different, because if somebody is coming from an individualistic society, they'll not worry about that identity because they don't feel that attachment that much. Whereas those that are coming from a collective society, they worry about those identities much. And there have been studies that have shown that people would change their identity to be even opposite in different platforms, because they're afraid that if they portray this identity on this particular group or platform, then there are people close to them whom they feel that they will not be comfortable with. So I think that's another thing to say. As communicators, when you're communicating, we have to bear in mind that to those people who are communicating in various platforms, they may change their identity based on how they believe about the importance of the group they're part of, or who is part of that social media platform where they're interacting.
Definitely. That goes back to that vacillation between online and offline communities. And what's interesting is how generations are coalescing around social media identity, which may predicate their identity more so than the collectivist or individualistic ways of associating oneself with a group. And so how too is social media disrupting our traditional ideas of social identity, and what implications will that have on cultural studies moving forward? So I want to open up the floor now to just answer any questions that you all might have, or any comments that are happening in your head, or any brainstorming you want to do. I'd just love to hear from you all about this research and how it resonated.
Katie, something that I was thinking about as you were giving your presentation is, so we know that people create their own social media identities, and some of those identities are more likely to reject our communication delivery. And I just kept thinking about, how do we reach them, and how can we reach them in a way that does our communications about our research, it represents it correctly. It obviously has to represent it correctly, but it's like, how do you transform your messaging to reach these groups on social media who are already in a position to reject what you're going to say, no matter what you say?
That is the absolute golden question. And one of the reasons I was first interested in this topic, because we conducted a literature review, so we don't have concrete answers for how to do that. But one thing I have been looking at more so is this identity formation and the values that are associated with that. So if we look at climate change, a lot of people automatically default to political polarization based on conservative or liberal ideology. But some other things that might be contributing to that are not just political ideology, but what do people believe the role of the government is? And that is associated with political ideology, but not always as binary as the political ideologies are that we talk about. It also may be looking at how people's religion impacts their views on a subject. And so as far as, I don't have any answers for how to change those messaging strategies, but what I can encourage you to do is look beneath the categorizations that we use to traditionally segment audiences and look at the why behind that group membership. And it's more difficult with echo chambers on social media because the algorithms kind of prevent us from getting our messages to targeted communities. But if we can look at how those presuppositions were formed, whether it's religious-based or populist-based, I think that can help us be more, at least more empathetic in our messaging, which sounds a bit qualitative of me, but I think it really helps when we're trying to communicate with audiences. They need to know that we empathize with them, even if their views are diametrically opposed to our own. And so I think that empathy and understanding can actually go a long way in changing our messaging strategies to really get at that effective valuation within community groups.
Maybe another thing that we need to be mindful is to understand that, like we said, these people are identifying themselves differently based on the social media that they're using, as well as even within the same social media, where do they feel like they belong? So I'll give an example. There's another research that I also did with Dr. Lam and another student, where you're looking at how people are using Twitter, especially when getting information about climate change. And we discovered that they're on Twitter, they're there to argue. So they're not following all these people on Twitter because they agree to what these people are saying, but they just want to make sure they have a conversation and they argue with those people. It's just for argument. They just are opposing views and just making sure that they make their views known. So if we as communicators understand that, to say, if you're going to post something on Twitter, you know that chances are high it's going to be an argument, then you have to think twice to say, is this research worthy for me to share through Twitter? When you talk about Facebook as well, we talked about Facebook groups where people join because the assumption is that everybody in that group believes in the same way. So whatever is going to happen there, if you know that this group is for people who believe about this thing in a certain way, that's where you're going to target if your message is going to resonate with those people. So it's just being mindful to say, who are you reaching out to and which platforms are you using and how are you using them? So knowing what the message that you're sending and the differences that exist based on people's beliefs surrounding that message, and at the same time, motivations for them to use different social media platforms. I think that's the best thing that we can work around, making sure that our messages are effective, because we cannot rule out to say we will not send a message that will offend somebody. But the question is to say, where and how are you going to send that message?
Assume someone will be offended and work backwards to minimize your effect, essentially. Any other questions or thoughts that we can address?
I just wanted to Dr. Fowles is spot on about Twitter. I know this personally from the person that I live with, who goes on Twitter every day to fight, and I know that's what he's doing.
Well, I think we'd all just like to thank you for attending, for engaging in the conversation and in our Jamboard process. And we hope you all got something out of it. It was really interesting to see all of your takeaways as we watch this moving object, right, of social media.
And I just want to thank all of you for doing this webinar. Our series for this fall and the spring is focusing on articles in JAC because it's important research, and we can all improve what we do every day by learning from the people that research what we do. So thank you all.